Welcome to Progressive Soup. My name is David Stevenson, and I'm tonight's host. Tonight we have a second visit from Nisi Marr, who's the 5th District Team Leader for the Peace Alliance, for the Alliance for Peace. Nisi, first of all, let's backtrack and refresh all of our viewers' memories and recollections about what the Peace Alliance is and what your goals are.
Well, the Peace Alliance is a citizens group of volunteers from around the country, and with the express goal of establishing a Department of Peace within the United States government. And it is, it's represented in all 50 states across the country, and in each district within each state there is a representative in most of the districts. And I am the team leader for District 5 for the state of Connecticut. And the Peace Alliance, as mentioned, is, it has the express goal of establishing a cabinet-level Department of Peace within the United States government. And there is a bill currently in the House of Representatives. It's H.R. 808, and it has over 70 co-sponsors right now. Some of them Republicans, which is wonderful, and it's gaining tremendous momentum. It's very exciting.
Well, we'll talk further about the economic ramifications, because we always like to talk about, with anything that we're proposing and everything that's in that formative stage in Congress, about the economic ramifications, what it's going to cost, and how much money is it going to save. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But you had some other things that you wanted to go into a little bit greater depth about.
Well, I think what I'd like to do, David, if that's okay, is to talk to you really about the need to establish a Department of Peace within the United States government. Right now in this country, we spend in excess of over $300 billion a year addressing violent conflict, not just issues that people have and they can't resolve. We're talking actual violent conflict in this country. Some people estimate it's in excess of $700 billion. And when you think of between all of the school shootings, the gang violence that happens, the domestic violence in this country, in the state of Michigan, the city of Detroit alone, 80% of the calls that the police stations receive are domestic violent calls. So it is clearly it's an epidemic in the United States, and it's also an epidemic around the world. You know, when you take a look at what's happening internationally, there are wars going on continually. There are terrorist attacks. There's so many human rights abuses. It's absurd. And clearly, we must develop a culture of peace in our country, in our communities, and in our world. Because if we don't, things, they're heading south fast in terms of violent conflict, and we need to move into a different, move in a different way.
I remember the discussion last time taking us to the number of people in prison per capita in the United States being the highest of I believe it was any country in the world.
If without a doubt, the incarceration rate in this country exceeds any other industrialized country. We spend, again, billions of dollars incarcerating these people, and when they get out into the community, within a very short time, 65% of them are back in. 85% of youth violent offenders are back in prisons immediately after they get out. So clearly the healing or resolving the issues that created the problem to begin with have not even been addressed. We are after the horses have been let out of the barn, we're trying to clean it up, when in fact we need to focus on developing situations where people don't get involved with, violent conflict to begin with.
That's a very high recidivism rate. And you mentioned, again, I want to clarify that you mentioned that it's even higher with youthful offenders than it is with adult offenders?
Well, actually, I'm going to put my glasses on here so I can read some of the statistics on violence. Yes, the youth offenders, the recidivism rate, believe it or not, is 85%, which is enormous. So when you look at a child, basically 11 or 12 years old in an inner city, the likelihood that they are going to be incarcerated probably by the time they're 16 years old is so high, it's enormous. That has got to stop. And the only way that it can stop is if we prevent it right from the get-go, so that they don't get into the juvenile justice system to begin with.
Preventative medicine, so to speak, for violent offenders or offenders in general.
Without a doubt. So, for instance, statistics on violence. The World Health Organization estimates that the cost of interpersonal violence in the U.S. is more than $300 billion, as mentioned. The cost of victims was estimated at $500 billion a year. So, you know, for instance, we might spend $300 billion just on all of the law enforcement agencies that have to address domestic violence issues. But then all of these people have to get involved in the whole system of social services and all of that, and that costs, you know, just a tremendous amount of money. So it's enormous.
So again, if that's something approaching $1 trillion, and we're becoming accustomed to hearing the word trillion a lot more recently with some of the deficits and things of that nature, that $1 trillion really strikes home, whereas maybe the term billion isn't so. Doesn't hit as hard as it used to. But if we're hearing $300 billion and some additional $500 billion in terms of...
That's close to $1 trillion.
Yeah.
It's excessive. It truly is. The youth homicide rate in the United States is 10 times that of any leading industrialized country. I mean, 10 times higher. It's just amazing, the amount of expenditures that we spend for local, state, and federal governments. You know, what we spent between '82 and 2005 for, you know, violent conflict resolution, etc., increased 619%.
So 6 times over.
Oh my God, the violent conflict in this country it's escalating. You know, it is escalating. People are acting out. They do not have the tools and the self-control to actually turn the corner and walk out of the room, or it's just ridiculous.
So we're talking in terms of acquired skills rather than, you know, we have nature versus nurture, the argument that goes back and forth, it always has.
Sure.
On some that people are, some people will say that we're born the way we're programmed to be the way we're going to be, and the other side of the argument is that we can be taught. We learn everything along the way. We start off as a clean slate and then learn the good and the bad of what we become.
Well, I'm on the side of nurture.
Nurture.
Truly, I am. I do believe if you're brought up in an emotionally healthy, loving family, the opportunity or you know, for you to get involved in a violent conflict is probably in 0% rate, or it's very rare. So the nurture aspect of it is very important. I just, David, wanted to point out in 2005, for instance, there were almost 6,000 young people between the ages of 10 and 24 that were murdered, which is 16 kids a day. So, I mean, it's just amazing.
So one for each of, one for every 3
That's
states.
Right. Exactly. 1 in 6 American women have been victims of attempted or completed rape. 10% of sexual assault victims are men, believe it or not. In 2007, approximately 14,000 terrorist incidents occurred worldwide. It's just incredible. I mean, the statistics are staggering. Something has got to change. Establishing a Department of Peace and a culture of peace in the United States is truly the only way to turn the tide, and we must invest in it. We must invest in it.
I hear the word invest in it, and that strikes a very positive chord, I think, with people, no matter what their political persuasion is, because if we can invest $1 somewhere, anywhere, and it brings us a better return than $1, that's certainly money well spent.
Absolutely. The bill that's currently in the House now is asking or calling for $10 billion to establish the Department of Peace. And once established, we would have a budget, an annual budget, to start of $10 billion. 85% of that money would go toward domestically. So it would be applied locally for our communities so that we could develop programs and oversee them to ensure that, you know, young children don't get involved in gangs, so that we have educational programs in our schools to teach, literally, to teach skills so that we do not get involved in any kind of violence. It's a, you know, and it would be an investment. Now, the return on that would be enormous, based upon how much we're spending to clean up after violent conflict occurs in this country.
Well, in real dollar terms, if you could invest $10 billion and then reduce, let's say, $500 billion by 10%, now you've automatically paid for itself 5 times over.
Absolutely.
With only a 10%
Now you're making money in terms of, you know, really what you're getting in return. So truly it makes perfect financial sense to actually invest the dollars into these programs to establish a Department of Peace, to ensure that we develop a culture of peace in this country. It's going to pay off, you know, in spades if we make a commitment to this.
You mentioned in our first discussion an example of where they brought a program into a prison setting and had some very phenomenal results and very positive outcomes on educating prisoners in nonviolent resolution of conflicts. Could you refresh us about that?
Yeah, it was. It's an organization called EVITA, and I am not entirely certain, but I believe it's EVITA. And they developed a model, and it's called the PAR model, P-A-R. And what they did is they did an experiment. They went into a level 5 prison in the state of Washington, and they educated the guards, and they educated just a percentage of the guards and a percentage of the inmates on how to avoid and or resolve violent conflict using the tools of the PAR model. And that went on for, I believe it was about 2 weeks or a 3-week, you know, study. And after that was done, they expected maybe a 5% reduction in violence in the prison. Now you can imagine, in a level 5 prison,
It's very high.
every single day there are violent conflicts. I mean, that is just that's just the life.
That's where you have your gang members, your lifetime criminals, essentially, that have in many cases.
This is the way that they communicate.
Many of them in there for murder and other heinous crimes.
Precisely. So they employed the tools or the techniques of the PAR model, and what happened was astonishing. The prison officials contacted the organization, the EVITA organization, and what they discovered was that within that 2-week period, they had 0 violent conflict in the entire prison for the entire time that they implemented this study.
Is there follow-up to that?
Yes.
How much? Obviously, you're going to have a little bit of a wearing off of the benefit of something over a period of time.
Yes, it lasted for a long time. I mean, in that 2-week period, there were no violent conflicts at all. And then I'm sure gradually, when people kind of reverted back to their old way of being, then I'm sure it started up again.
And perhaps new inmates coming in that had not been exposed to the program.
Precisely. Now, this is a perfect example of getting some of the most brilliant minds together to develop models like that and employ them in situations like prison reform, and where that's how the Department of Peace would support that financially and on every other level, bringing the best of the best together, and then, of course, to measure these models, to measure them, to be sure that they are delivering what they promise in terms of the reduction of violent conflict.
Now, you mentioned about 85% of the budget going toward domestic programs. What about the other 15%? Is that foreign usage, or is that what you would call overhead or administrative costs?
Actually, the other 15% would be focused on international conflict. It would be on reducing international conflict, bringing the heads of each government together and having all of us agree that, yes, we are going and we are committed to developing a culture of peace. These are the ways that we're going to do this, and so that everyone is working together to ensure that we have, we all get a chance to live in a peaceful world.
Okay. We're going to take a break for a public service announcement in about another 30 seconds. But if there's one more thought you'd like to share with us and with our viewers prior to that, and then we'll use that as a springboard to continuing the discussion.
Okay, well, one thing I'd like to say is that when the Department of Peace is established, there will be an Academy of Peace, which will be a sister school, much like the military academies in this country, and I'd like to talk about that later.
Interesting. Okay, well, we'll broach that subject when we come back. Thank you very much.
One more correct answer, and you're the big winner in the Social Security quiz. And here we go. What will the Social Security statement tell you about your retirement? A, the date you should retire. B, how much you can expect your Social Security benefits to be. Or C, what you will owe in taxes.
I know this. I remember getting my Social Security statement in the mail, and I know it's B.
Are you absolutely sure?
Yes, that's my final answer.
Well, you're right. Congratulations.
Retirement planning is not a game. Watch your mail for your Social Security statement and use it to plan your financial future. Remember, Social Security should only be part, not all, of your retirement income. The future is in your hands.
Welcome back to Progressive Soup. Nisi Mar, with the Alliance for Peace, the 5th Congressional District in Connecticut, is going to give us some more specifics about the programs that we're talking about. And we'll take it from there.
Thanks, David. I appreciate that. When the Department of Peace is established in the United States government, the President would appoint a Secretary of Peace, and it would be just like the Secretary of State or the Secretary of Defense. It would have just as much power, funding, and leverage in terms of advising the President on the best solutions to resolving conflict nationally and internationally. We would also establish a Peace Academy, and that would be so that people could go to school and learn and get degrees in peace building. And there are already, apparently, in the past 10 or 15 years, there are over 300 degree programs in universities in the United States today. So truly, it is, truly people understand that there's a huge need for this, and also the Department of Peace would fund new and existing citizen-based programs throughout the country. So those are just some of the things that the Department of Peace would do. And then I also wanted to talk about the different offices that would be under the umbrella of the Department of Peace. The Office of Peace Education and Training, that would be the Academy, the Peace Academy. The Office of Domestic Peace Activities, that would focus on not only nationally domestic peace activities, but also, locally in our schools, in our communities, and things like that. The Office of International Peace Activities, that's where that 15% of the $10 billion budget would go toward that. The Office of Technology for Peace, it would be employing the most cutting-edge, the latest uses of technology to support the whole effort toward peace building and developing that culture of peace all over the country and the world.
An office to implement those programs.
Exactly.
And looking back on things that have been tried and improving them.
Exactly. The statistical studies to make sure that everything is being employed and it's delivering results in the end. The Office of Arms Control and Disarmament. Certainly the Department of Peace would focus on disarming the United States and every other country in the world. Hopefully, one day we will all get together and realize that we must disarm the world so that is not hanging over our heads. And so the Department of Peace would certainly oversee that and focus on that. The Office of Peaceful Coexistence and Nonviolent Conflict Resolution would be another office, and also one on human rights and economic rights. And certainly that would be nationally and international.
Sounds like something that might be handled at this point under the World Bank or something of that nature under the World Bank, which does some investment along those lines in terms of getting people started with seed money in businesses.
Absolutely. So some of the programs that the Department of Peace would develop and oversee, one of them is Baltimore's existing program. It's called Community Conferencing, and it has the goal of reducing the recidivism rate. So people, once they get out of jails, they don't go back in, and it is hugely successful. It exceeds 60% of the inmates that get out of prison do not go back in. Today,
very good step in the right direction.
That's absolutely correct. Today in this country, it's just the opposite. 65% go back into prison immediately.
So that's reversing those numbers.
Precisely. That's right. Now, you were asking me earlier, David, about other things that, other types of legislation that the Department of Peace would support, and one of them is the Youth Promise Act. And the Youth Promise Act is officially endorsed by the Department of Peace. It's actually a bill that's in the House of Representatives today and has over 200 co-sponsors.
That's
it's huge.
Nearly half of the members of Congress.
Right. And the goal, of course, is to keep, it targets youth that are at risk of being incarcerated, of getting involved in gangs, of dropping out of school, of being incarcerated. And they are, what they're doing is, or what they intend to do, is go into communities and have officials develop councils. So you'd have law enforcement people, you would have social services people, you'd have educators, you'd have schools that would all come together, and they would develop programs necessary to keep these youth that are at risk off, out of gangs, and get them off the streets, so to speak, and really provide them with alternatives so that they can grow and have very positive lives.
So again, what we would describe in a medical sense is a preventive medicine to keep people from actually developing, if you would think of criminality as an illness, to prevent that from happening, so you don't have to rescue them afterwards.
Exactly. You know, the Department of Peace would all be about prevention. It would be about healing what is existing right now that needs to be healed, and developing programs to prevent these types of things from happening to begin with. Truly, we need to learn how to within ourselves. Truly, it all starts with ourselves. We need to learn how to resolve conflict within ourselves, and then take it within our families, and then into our schools and our communities, and then it grows and expands. So truly, it all does ultimately begin with us, and the Department of Peace would have programs that would help us develop the tools so that we could help ourselves and then help our families and our communities. So it really, it has a lot going for it. I do want to mention that part of my job as the Connecticut 5 district leader is to get our representative congressperson, Chris Murphy, to co-sponsor the bill that's in the House, H.R. 808. And as yet, he has not signed on to that. We do expect that eventually he will, because the Department of Peace, or the bill is gaining a lot of momentum, and people understand that it is necessary. So we're asking, you know, all the people that are listening to the program to go onto the website and to get involved in any way that they can. There are many opportunities to get involved, and once they log on to the website, they can send email, letters, faxes, etc., to Chris Murphy, asking him to support the Department of Peace. They can also get involved in the way that I am, through fundraising, through talking to the media, and really just promoting the whole concept of what the Peace Alliance is.
Well, like anything else, it appears to be very much a grassroots organizational effort from the bottom up, with people involved in telling their elected officials what they want to focus on, and standing behind them and pushing them when necessary to focus on those issues.
Without a doubt. Another topic I'd like to just mention briefly is the Student Peace Alliance, which is an offshoot of the Peace Alliance, and these are schools, high schools and universities around the country that are committed to establishing a Department of Peace. When I went to Washington, D.C. back in the month of March, where the Peace Alliance had their national conference, 1/3 of the people that were in attendance, there were several hundred people in attendance, 1/3 were all kids from universities and high schools around the country attending.
That's wonderful.
So it really was a very exciting thing to see. That
so many things so many things that are good about America start with the youth of America, start with kids getting, not being apathetic, but actually getting involved, and they have that enthusiasm usually, and that idealism that a lot of us, that tends to wear off over the years. So it's certainly good to see them pushing their parents. And
well, I think it's great, because what you have is you have the students, the younger generation, believing in this, and you have the older generation believing in this. Years ago in the 60s, it wasn't like that. You just had one generation that believed in something, the other one thought this is absurd. Well, now there's this cohesive goal or mission among all the people. They've come together and they realize that it is critical. We must develop a culture of peace in the United States. And establishing a Department of Peace is the way to do that. Other countries as well are establishing departments of peace. Costa Rica is one of them. In fact, there is a global Peace Alliance meeting in Costa Rica in September, and apparently the country is ready right now to establish a Department of Peace. So there are representatives from all over the world that will be meeting in Costa Rica to grow that whole international effort, so that the world is focused on doing this together. It's very exciting.
That certainly is. It's almost mind-boggling that in a time when we have so many things that are wrong with the world, and wrong with life around us, to see such an important thing being focused on.
Well, we have to hold the vision. We have to believe that we can improve ourselves. We have to believe that we can improve humanity. And when you really look at the world today, there are so many wonderful things that are going on. There truly are. I mean, people are more compassionate, more caring than they've ever been before. On the other end of it, though, there is more violence than there ever has been before. So truly, the compassionate part of us, we all must come together and hold the vision collectively. And when we do that, it empowers and supports the entire system, because in the end, goodness always wins. I mean, truly, that is who we are, essentially.
We've seen that through history, where we can look back in history and find a lot of very horrific things in the history of our civilization that don't go on anymore. We don't have a lot of the very horrible things that have happened there. We've learned to overcome them. We don't have genocide to the degree that it was, and we still have it occasionally, but it's not to the degree that if you look back 500 years or 1,000 years in the history, it happened much worse. Okay, we're going to wrap up this segment now. We have about 30 seconds. If you have additional thoughts that you'd like to give us a springboard into the next session.
What I'd like to do is encourage our viewers to log on to thepeacealliance.org.
The Peace Alliance.
Yes, not to be confused with any other web address. It's thepeacealliance.org, and to really spend some time cruising around that website and learning about what the bill is, and also how to get involved locally.
Great. There's a task for our viewers. I'm David Stevenson. We have Nisi Marr with us, and this has been Progressive Soup.